All right. So, welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar night. Like I said, my name is LP Mainville. I'm the High Performance Manager for the OVA. I'm really happy to have you guys on this webinar on Thanksgiving Monday. So I hope you had a great long weekend and you spent some good time with your family and friends. And now you're just about to learn some stuff about volleyball. So how could it end the weekend in a better way? So um, before I go on and to present your presenter for tonight, I just want to let you know that you can get PD points tonight from being on this live webinar. The only thing you need to do is make sure, if you haven't done so already, just please put your full name into the chat box, especially if you have your name as being viewer 14 or viewer 18. I need to know who you are if you want me to give you your PD points. Okay, so just do that. And the other thing that I'm going to say is about questions tonight during your session. The questions, you can ask them at any time. I know your presenter will be looking at them, and I will be helping as well, monitoring the questions. So feel free to ask anything at any moment in time. Okay, so tonight we have a session on seasonal planning, really important topic at this time of year. Richard Eddy will be your presenter, and just a little bit of background on Richard. He's the head coach at University of Waterloo. He has coached with Team Ontario for the past couple of years. He was the head coach for the women's program for Canada Games. So I got to know Rich a lot, and he's really detailed in his planning and preparation, and he's also the first one who's gone through the new level 3 evaluation. So the performance coach evaluation that got rolled out this past year. Richard was the first one to actually go through and be successful, and the evaluators had lots of good stuff to say about his seasonal plan. So it just made sense to have him present on this topic this fall. So you're going to have a great session. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass the presentation to him. So just allow a couple seconds for the transition to happen, and he'll take it away. Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Okay, I think I am up, but if someone could, similar to LP, just type yes in the chat box. If you could hear me, I would appreciate that. Oh, thanks, Jerry. On the ball. Hi, Amy. Okay, let's get started. Sounds like people can hear me. This topic is on seasonal planning, and when LP asked me to do this, as he mentioned, I have gone through the recent performance coach program and managed to make it through that successfully. And the season plan component of that was a pretty thorough and intense process. I learned a lot through that process. I think there are a number of resources that I'm going to show you tonight that should help you with your own plans. And I think the other thing just to note here is this is a huge topic, and there are at least 2 NCCP courses with this topic in mind, and I'm going to try to condense some of that material for you into something that lasts less than an hour. So it's natural that I might move quickly past some items that perhaps require a little more explanation, or I spend too much time on something that you know all about. If so, I apologize. I am going to try to condense this material into something that I think will allow you to come up with a good season plan for your team. And let's get started from there. So The problem, I guess, that the OVA had identified in asking for this session to occur was that we all believe that season planning is a really effective and useful tool, but a lot of coaches aren't using a plan. Maybe it's too complex. Maybe you don't know how to build one. Judging by some of the people on this call, I think you probably do know how to build one and you're just looking for some new ideas. That's all great. I'm going to walk you through some of my steps. And at the end, hopefully we have accomplished something, perhaps a better understanding of how the plan will help your team and your athletes, give you some ideas on how to assess your athletes' abilities and assess your team performance, and then set goals that will allow them to get better as the season goes on. You get some ideas on how to build out a real actual plan that's simple is maybe overstated here. It might not seem as simple once we go through, but I'll try to keep it simple. And lastly, as I mentioned, there's a lot of resources out there to help you. I'm going to highlight some of those and hopefully allow you to pull together a lot of information that's going to help you get your team up and running. So first, let's just talk about this quickly. Why do you need a plan? Most of us have probably heard the quote at the top of the screen by Benjamin Franklin, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. So we want to be well prepared. Planning is something that will help you and your team identify and achieve their goals. So by planning ahead, we can actually plan for the success of our team. A plan is a guideline of what we intend to do and achieve, and we can also set goals for our team and then systematically train towards them. So a plan is going to help us outline these things. It's going to be a very useful exercise in providing direction for our team as well. It's a roadmap. In a plan, we will be able to set up some milestones that will allow us to look back and check if we are on track. We can evaluate our team as the season unfolds and make adjustments if we need to. And one of the great things that is often overlooked is it just is a way to keep yourself on track, your athletes on track, focus on what is important at that particular stage of the plan, and not get caught in a wild goose chase on how we get kind of from some arbitrary starting point to an arbitrary finish point. A good analogy is if you were to plan a trip somewhere, obviously we would want to do some planning ahead of time versus just setting out on a road and hoping we end up in the right spot. We want to actually do our research up front, figure out how to get where we're going, and then make sure we follow our steps. So a couple other ideas. Planning is preparing. When we work through this, you'll see that we can proactively anticipate some problems or challenges that might come up ahead of time. We'll also realize that we've got some challenges in terms of time and resources that we need to manage with our group. And we want to do that as efficiently as possible so we can accomplish all of our development objectives. Quick story on this is there was a team I'm aware of last year that had not anticipated that their starting setter was actually going to be unavailable for nationals for at least 1 or 2 days because she was an IB student. What happened is that team ended up going to nationals and having to play the backup left side as a setter. So had perhaps some better questioning or planning been done up front, that team could have maybe trained a setter to step in when they were in the peak of their season. Okay. Another thing, just for all of us, planning is professional. If you deal with parents through your team, it's definitely a way to increase accountability. And then some other ideas. It's less stressful to coach when you have a great plan. You'll get more done. Your practices will be better, and everyone will have a little bit more fun through the whole process. So just some good ideas there for why we actually go through this process. All right. So planning. We need to get from A to B. All right. So how do we do that? Well, first, we need to figure out where are we today. So we need to look at our team, assess our athletes, and determine where are we today. Then we have to be very clear about where we're going. Okay. We have only a finite amount of time, as we've mentioned, and we need to figure out what we can accomplish in the time we have and we need to have a clear plan to get there. And then obviously that's the third piece, is how do we actually get there? How do we actually get from A to B? So I'm going to start by talking about how to determine where you are today. Then I'm going to talk about how to look at or set a future or end state for where we want to go. And then we're going to talk about the actual plan on how we get there. So where are we today? We need to know our starting point. We need to plan ahead. So you'll hear the word context used throughout this presentation. Establish your context. Your context is the situation or the circumstances that you are coaching in. We want to be very clear on what that is. We want to gather the information that we can about our team, our athletes. We want to assess them and understand who they are, what skills they have, what their physical attributes are. We want to know what tournaments that we're playing in throughout the course of a year. If we have exhibition matches, if we have scrimmages, if we are going down to the US for a tournament, if we're going to nationals. Don't wait until January to figure these things out. You want to do that up front so that you can get all your ducks in a row at the start of your season and plan your time very wisely. Another thing that I really like to do is collect baseline performance data. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second and what that means. But essentially, if we can use an early tournament, an exhibition tournament. I know a lot of times teams get together and there's some sort of exhibition play within the first few weeks of the season. If we can use that tournament to collect some information and statistics about our team, we can get a really clear idea of where we are at the start of the year. And we can use that information to help set the path forward to reach our final goal. When we talk about where we're going, we're going to talk about defining our end state, creating a vision for our team and what we can accomplish in the season ahead. We're going to set performance goals that are measurable, and we are going to establish our development or our training priorities. And that's all part of figuring out where we are going with our team, okay? And one really important thing that I think gets overlooked sometimes is be able to know your why. Know why you're doing the things that you're doing. It's not good enough to say, oh, the national team does something this way, or I watch McMaster men's volleyball and they hand pass, so my team needs to hand pass, or I watch University of Toronto women's volleyball and they do this, so I should do that. That's not a good enough reason. You need to know why you do what you do on your team. And a good exercise for you is to have your parents or your athletes question, hey coach, why are we doing this? That is not a bad question in our gym. That's a good question. We want that question. We want to know, we want to be able to tell people why we're doing what we're doing. So keep that in mind as you go through the planning process, because what could happen is that you see a plan that we build out together here on the webinar and you think, well, I should do it that way because, Richard does it that way or LP does it that way. No, you can still do it your own way. You just have to have a reason why, okay? How do we get there? We're going to build a training schedule. We're going to talk again about what we're going to train, when we're going to train, why, and then maybe a little bit of how we actually do it, okay? And then in the end, we're going to come up with something kind of scary looking like this, but hopefully it doesn't look as scary as we build it out together as we go. All right, so where are we today? Again, we want to know what we have to work with. What are our athletes' current level of physical and technical abilities? I know everyone is probably already through their tryout period. That would have been a great time to make these assessments. We also need to know the development age or the development stage that our athletes are in the long-term athlete development model. I can remember when I first started coaching and I heard about this, I kind of dismissed it as, oh, it's some document that someone I don't know wrote, and I don't need to pay a lot of attention to it. But it is full of great information about how athletes develop at various ages, and that's going to be really useful to you when you develop your own context, when you look at the athletes that you have in your gym, male or female, whatever age they may be, there is some information in the long-term athlete development handbook that will allow you to get a clear picture on what you should be training in your season and what your athletes are most likely to improve at or are most physically geared towards improving at their current development age. So that's going to be a real useful tool for you, and I'll show you in a moment how to find that if you don't already have a copy of that. You need to know the competition dates. I mentioned that already, but I'm gonna show you again why that's important. Know your practice dates and times, and know all the other details that are going to affect the quality or schedule for your season. So do you train in one gym or do you train in two gyms? That's going to be, and that's going to impact the types of practices you have. Are there times where the school's closed for the high school dance, for renovations? That's going to affect your schedule. Are some of your key players going on vacation at inopportune times? You're going to need to know these things. Does the gym you train in have antennas? How many balls do you have? What kind of balls do you have? Lots of questions. The more information you can get up front, this is what I'm trying to stress, the more info you can get up front, the clearer you can be on where you are today. Okay? Here is a little bit more of a discussion about the LTAD. So as I mentioned, the LTD provides some guidelines and recommendations for the athletes in your gyms. And you want your seasonal plan to reflect what appears in the long-term athlete development model. Now, I've heard this model is under review, but this is still the current model. I've included a link to actually all the resources that I'm going to talk about. There is a link to in this presentation. I'm not sure if you guys can actually click on the screen and get that. I think with the LTAD, if you actually just go into Google, LP mentioned this the other night, and type LTAD volleyball, it's one of the first things that comes up. So if you feel like referencing that at any point, that is something that is going to be of use to you. And I've also just tried to summarize some of the key points in case we have people across the spectrum coaching different ages on the webinar tonight. Here are some of the things that you're going to want to take from the LTAD. So basically, you're going to want to know what development stage your athletes are in, what the goal is of that stage, and where your athletes fit in, what the recommended training to competition ratio. We're going to talk a lot about that as well. This is how much your team should be training versus how much they should be competing. Okay, so kind of simple, but this is just a summary of some of the info you need to know if you're not able to find the manual online. Okay. Now, some other things that you're going to want to know. Here's a handy worksheet actually that you can find on the Volleyball Canada Coaches Resources website, and what it is basically a tool for you to assess your athletes. You can use it anytime, obviously, but beginning of the year is probably a good time to do this, so you can get a look on where everyone is at, and then you can use this to help set some goals for your individual players. Some of the other things, as I note on the slide, of what you'd like to know about your athletes: are they male or female? Perhaps that will impact the dynamic that you have in your gym. How many players do you have? Do you have 7 players or do you have 17 players? That's going to impact the type of practices that you can have and the amount of volume that each player is going to get in those practices. We've talked about technical abilities, age. Are they single or multi-sport athletes? If you're coaching 18U girls or boys, maybe volleyball is their only sport. But if you're coaching 14-year-old girls or boys, maybe there's another team that they play on. Maybe they play basketball or football or something at high school that competes with volleyball. You're going to want to know that up front. You may have athletes with previous injuries. One thing that we know for sure is that past injuries are always a good indicator of future injuries. So it's a really good idea to figure out, do you have anyone with concussion problems? Do you have anyone who has a family history of ACL tears? Things like that are going to help you know your team a little bit better, and then hopefully plan ahead for some eventualities that may appear throughout your season. The other thing that you're going to want to know, this is really handy, is your competition dates. So the OVA produces a competition calendar every year, and there it is on the screen. You also want to know, as I mentioned, several of these other things that may impact your training plan. For instance, the Ontario Championships. Most teams play in that. That's kind of the thing that we all look forward to at the end of the year. U.S. tournaments are pretty popular these days. Holidays, school closures, nationals, vacations, etc. Whatever it may be, these things are going to impact your plan, so you need to know about them. This is part of your starting point. All right. One thing that we're going to do as we look at our plan is we're going to place a priority on some of the competitions that occur throughout our season. And this is a bit of, I don't know if a sticking point is the right word, but it's a fairly contentious issue at times with club volleyball. And the question is it important to win every competition, or is it more important to focus on the development of the athletes? I'm not going to state an opinion on that. I think you can probably accomplish both with a good plan. But either way, we should be able to place a priority on the different competitions that we're going to play in. So this chart, you could do this on paper. You don't need to come up with a fancy Excel spreadsheet or anything, but you could look at all the competitions that you're going to play in the year, designate one or two that you would consider high priority. For instance, in one example, it might be the Ontario Championships or Nationals. You could designate some others that are medium priority, where maybe we want to do well, but we care more about the performance factors related to how we played, such as the OVA Grand Prix. Or maybe we have some low priority competitions. These are the local exhibition matches, the scrimmages, the U.S. tournaments, things that don't really have a bearing on your athletes' final outcome goals, but would be good opportunities to do other things with your team, such as building your team, having fun, going away, spending some time together, focusing on a particular skill or set of skills that you want to work on. We need to have a good mix of these priorities in our calendar so that we can align our training to when we need to be at our peak performance. So it's a good exercise to go through and identify what our competition priorities really are. Okay. And then I want to talk just quickly about baseline performance. And I mentioned these are stats or indicators that you can collect early in the year, where you can analyze your team in a way that's not just visual. It's not just you watching them in practice and coming to some conclusions. This is data tied to volleyball performance that you can use to both figure out where you guys are today, and then using those same statistics, track how you're developing and improving over the course of the year. Okay. Volleyball Canada has a plus-minus sheet, actually a worksheet that's really easy to use. That's basically just all the things that you do well or earn points for your team, minus all the errors that you cause for your team, and it comes up with a plus or a minus number, which is just an indicator of performance. It's a really simple way to track your team's performance or your individual performances in tournaments or exhibition. We do that a lot, even at the university level, and I know it's done, pretty much at all levels as just one indicator of performance. On the right side of the screen, you see some more specific statistical measurements, or just examples. If stats are not your thing, here are some more resources that you can use. Getting real specific here, but the NCAA loves to keep stats. They have both a manual for how to keep stats and all the various calculations, and then some videos that will tell you what plays fall into what stat category. So if you really want to get analytical, those resources are there for you as well. Okay. So that's a lot of talk about a lot of talk about how to figure out where you are today. Probably seems a little overwhelming. There's a lot of things to think about, but the one thing I want you to take away from that is the clearer image you have of where you are, the easier it is to figure out what you need to do to get better. Okay, and the same works in reverse as well. Where are we going? We want to know our end state. What are my team's performance goals? So we just talked about stats. Those are measurable pieces of information about your team. Well, we want to have performance goals that are also measurable. Anything that we do to improve, we want to be able to measure it. So we want to be able to set some goals on how we want to be able to perform by the end of the year or at various points in the year. We also want to have some outcomes. This could be, we want to finish in the top 5 at provincials and other sort of ambiguous goals like that. But those goals are not going to be enough to drive your team's performance. Talked about this, thinking measurable, and then we want to have a clear idea of what skills, techniques, and abilities that we want to be able to develop this season. And I have some resources for that. I'm going to just jump ahead of the goals, and I'm going to go to some resources that you can use to help find your end state. So there's some great resources, as I've noted on the right side of the screen here. Volleyball Canada has a website with videos on it of all the major skills being demonstrated with a brief explanation on how to do them. So if you're not someone that has a great eye for the skills and the techniques of the game, those videos are really going to give you a visual on what you want your athletes to look like when they're performing certain skills. And the great thing about skills is that regardless of age, the skills are pretty much stay the same. There aren't skills that are really taught differently at different ages. So if you coach a young team, the good news is that you're going to teach those athletes how to perform the skill the same way they're going to be asked to do it later in life. If you want to watch volleyball at a higher level, there's a link there for OUA matches. That's Ontario University Volleyball. So every Friday and Saturday night, there's a handful of games that get played, and then you can go on for free and watch those games the next day. That is just simply a resource there for you to watch some volleyball being played at a slightly higher level. I always like to use this analogy if there's any musicians in the group. Trying to teach the sport without knowing how it's being played at a slightly higher level is like trying to learn to play a song that you've never actually heard. It's one thing to see it on paper or read about it or have a gut feel for it, but you have to hear it and you have to practice and you have to listen over and over to really figure out how it's being played. So I think that same principle applies to sport. You want to watch a lot of volleyball. You've also got a link here to FIVB technical videos. That's from the World Championships in 2010. There's everything from serving to passing, attacking, blocking. Anything that you want to see individual or team skill-wise is there. The last link, and I apologize to the OVA, I'm not sure if the OVA has a curriculum quite the same as the one I'm about to show you, but this is a curriculum from Volleyball Alberta that basically outlines where you can create development opportunities for your athletes in each skill category between the ages of 16 and 18. So it really breaks it out nicely. I think it's a good resource for someone that may not have a great idea on what to train or how. There's some good information about each of the skills. So I would encourage you to look through that as well. And LP, if you can point me to something similar from Ontario Volleyball, we can definitely put that up on the presentation as well. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just step back for 1 second. And just in case anyone is unclear on this, I won't go through all of this, but it's really important that when we're looking at the end state, we distinguish between the types of goals that we want to set for our team. So outcome goals, these are like finish line goals that are really tied to winning or losing, and they're not really measurable. Like you see some examples here. I want to finish in the top 5 at provincials. I want to win a gold medal. I want to move into the championship division. Those are nice ideas and good to strive towards, but the outcome is not always in your control. You can't control the other teams. You don't know what they're doing. You don't know who's going to show up to play when the tournament comes. So the best way to measure our performance and to strive towards is a performance goal. These are things that are within our control. These are things that we can measure. And really, these are the building blocks of our outcome goals. So a performance goal is something like, I want my team to have a side out percentage of 55% by provincials. Or I want my left sides to be able to attack at a 25% efficiency rate by the time we get to the OVA Grand Prix. These are things we can measure and we can train towards. So now I can build a plan that ensures I reach, or at least do my best to get towards achieving these goals. And whether I win or lose is not going to impact my ability to achieve certain levels of performance. Okay. A process goal is something that you want to keep in mind as you're building out your practice plans. You're going to have these performance goals, but a process goal is something that you can use really in the training environment and as you're building out skills to ensure that your athletes are building out the components of the skills that are going to lead you to reaching your performance goals. So, for instance, there's a few examples there, but are my passers stopped 7 out of 10 times they pass the ball? That is something I can measure and watch for in practice. That is something I can design a drill around ensuring that they're able to do. Okay, I can't design a drill around finishing top 5 at provincials. Okay. One of the things that I like to do, this is maybe going a little bit beyond, but I like to study the game a lot. I like to research my league, my competition, and there's lots of stats and info out there if you look for it. And then I look for what are the things that correlate to winning. So here's one example on the right-hand side of the screen. I know in the OUA there's a very high correlation between winning and attacking efficiency. Maybe that's common sense, but I want to make sure that the data says that as well, and it does. So you don't have to be a statistician to do this kind of stuff, but you can find numbers and data out there that will help you decide, hey, where should we be at the end of the year? Where should we be by provincials? Okay. All right, so how do we get there? We've talked a lot about where are we? We've talked a lot about where do we want to go. Now let's talk about actually building the plan. So to do this, as I mentioned before, like there are 2 separate courses about building a plan, and they take all day to do, and I'm going to try to show you how to do this in a short amount of time. I do have the questions or the chat box up on the side of my screen. Please feel free to jump in if there's anything that I am glancing over, okay? But the first thing that I would say is there are some plans out there that you can use, you can download, and you can modify, or you can just use the templates that are provided to you. One of the ones that I am going to use or reference is the one available on Volleyball Canada's website, and it is under the coach's resource page. If you find the LTD that corresponds to your athletes, you can download a plan that is basically a template for you to use to build out your own training plan. The one that I'm going to use, I believe, is the train to train plan. So I'm going to modify that a little bit, and you'll see how. But if you want to follow along with what I'm doing, that's where I would suggest you go. For a slightly more advanced plan, you can look at the plan that is provided with the Performance Coach package. And they're basically the same, but one just has a little bit more information and it breaks things out into a very specific level of detail. Or if you're someone that is good on Excel or other spreadsheet program, you can definitely build your own. In fact, the more you go on in this coaching world, you'll find that sometimes it's easier to create things for yourself that maybe don't exist. So that's a good skill to have as well. So what are some other things that we want to consider before we get started? Well, we want to use the info we just gathered. We want to make sure we plan for all the aspects of our athletes' development, okay? Coaching is more than just, writing some drills on a napkin before practice and going in and keeping the kids entertained. We want to plan for our athletes' development. So we're going to make sure we think of all the ways and we reference the LTDAD for all the ways we should be training our athletes. The other thing is you want to make the most of your time. You may only practice 2 times a week. You may practice 3 times a week. Whatever it is, the number one thing I always hear from coaches is they wish they had more time to get more things done or train something more specifically. You have the time that you have. So it's your job to use your time wisely and make it the most effective use of time possible. And that's what will separate coaches is how can you use the time you have better for your athletes? How can you maximize the amount of improvement they get out of a practice, out of a drill? And so being efficient and well-planned becomes very important. And the other thing is, if you get stuck, ask for help. If you want to email me, LP, I'm sure would be happy to help as well. There are all kinds of coaches out here that love to do just that, which is coach and help people. So there's certainly no wall between myself and any of you. If anyone has any questions, please reach out anytime. Okay, so I mentioned the plan that I was going to borrow from. So if while I was talking, any of you downloaded a seasonal plan from the Volleyball Canada website, it should look something like this. And then I've modified it to be blank and look something like this. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through what all of this means, how to build a good plan, and how to consider all the factors that we've already discussed. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is build a timeline. We talked about identifying what stage we are in the long-term athlete development model. We talked about creating a schedule and evaluating our competitions to determine what's important, maybe what's not as important, and what's the least important. And we need to come up with a plan that is going to allow us to train through these competitions to peak at our most important competition. And for this example, I'm just going to assume that the provincial championships and the national championships are our most important competition. It might be totally different from your team. I heard a good example from LP the other day. He mentioned he wants his team to actually perform to win at an early tournament that would allow his team to move into the Premier Division. And then without much risk of dropping down, he was going to use this period of time following that to build his training up to towards provincials. That's a plan. He had a why for that. So that's perfectly okay. Have a why. For me, why? Why this? Well, I think those are the major competitions in the year. Those are our last time with our athletes. That's where we want to play our best and have the most fun. So that's why I'm going to use those as my particular competitions in this example. So you see I've highlighted some dates in green, some in yellow, some in red. So for me, I'm a visual guy. I like to associate a color with a priority. And in this case, I'm saying green refers to tournaments that are a low priority for me. Yellow is a medium priority, and red is the high priority. Okay. I've also inputted at the top, if you can see my mouse, what stage I'm in. So I'm saying I'm in the train to train stage, and the corresponding ideal training to competition ratio in that stage is a 70% of the time training, 30% of the time competing. Okay, I've got all my information about my athletes handy. I've got my schedule. I know what tournaments are important. Now I can start to build out my plan. Okay. One of the things that we need to do early on in our plan is determine what phases or periods we are going to train in. And I think this is the topic of some confusion on what do these different phases mean? What do you do in them? Why does it matter? So I want to talk to you a little bit about general preparation, specific preparation, and then the competitive phase or the competition phase. Okay, so I've come up with a very high level matrix, if you will, of how each phase may impact our training. And it's important to note that general preparation always comes first, specific preparation always comes second, and then competition preparation always comes third. But there are some sports, or perhaps when you're coaching at a higher level, where you may need or you may use or you may attempt to peak throughout the season at different times. We're not really going to go into those examples just because of time, but you can look at this and you can see that in a general preparation phase, we want to be focused on developing our skills and abilities. So acquisition of skills, biomechanics. When we get into specific preparation, we're going to be training our skills at greater intensity and under pressure. So there's a performance pressure aspect to training. And then when we get into our competition prep, we should be refining these skills and executing them in game-like or simulated game conditions. When it comes to tactics, or let's say decision-making and cue reading for individuals, we're able to build those skills out, those individual tactics and skills in the general prep phase. We don't do as much of the team tactics in the general preparation phase. So individual tactics and decision making, and we can introduce our team systems. And one thing that I like to do in the general preparation phase is, without spending a lot of time of teaching team systematic play, is to train the skills that my team needs within the context of the system that I'm going to play or introduce. So for example, my team has an initial defensive position that is approximately 1 meter in from the sideline and 1 meter back from the attack line. Well, if I'm going to do defensive acquisition drills, I will perform those drills from locations that will eventually fit into my team system. So that's just a note to help you kind of put into context how you would maybe introduce your system while still focusing on the individual tactics. In the specific prep period, this is more position-specific development, system development, consolidating systems, sequences of actions or decisions that we want to have flow together. And then obviously in the competition prep, these things we are training, we're executing them at a high level. They're not necessarily at the forefront of our minds. They're things that these skills that we've now acquired, consolidated, and are starting to refine within our gameplay. Physical development is going to be an important aspect of our plan. We need to understand how the body develops. First and foremost, we need to develop our movement, our functional movement. We need to be mobile. We need to have stability in our body, and we need to have core strength. That always precedes developing speed and power. And that's a really important note to understand is the body needs to be healthy and move efficiently before it can be explosive efficiently. So another way to say that is if we want to jump really high, we don't start our season and put all of our kids on a jump program when they've just come back from the summer and they're out of shape and we don't really know kind of where they're at physically. We need to build the body up and make sure it's moving efficiently, and we've done everything we can to prevent the possibility of injury before we try to bear an additional load or develop power. And that's something I feel is misunderstood at every level, is how we actually build our athletes' bodies before we do things like jump programs and heavy weightlifting. Okay. When we're in the competition phase, we actually want to pull back on trying to get gains with our physical development. We actually want to just work on maintaining our gains and keeping our bodies healthy. So that means that people should not be getting, achieving maximum lifts during their competition phase, unless they're in a high level program that's very with very close attention being paid to their body. So really want to just focus on maintaining our gains and keeping our body injury free when we're in the competition phase. From a mental standpoint, there's also a bit of a plan on how we want to introduce those skills. So we want to introduce skills like focus and visualization and goal setting. That could be goal setting for, hey, what do you intend to do at practice tonight? What are you working on? What's your to-do list? What have you brought to the gym? What are you intending to get better at tonight? Self-analysis is something that's becoming more and more relevant in our gyms today as well. We have a lot of video capture device. I know in my gym we use something, it's a TiVo device with a video camera. So every time we perform a skill, we can see it played back for us. You can do that kind of thing on your iPhone or iPads now. I think a lot of coaches have those tools. They're great tools. Teaching your kids how to watch themselves and analyze and come up with positive ways to improve is an important mental skill, versus the opposite of watching themselves perform a skill and then shying away from it because they feel they're not doing it well. Really ties into the growth mindset. And then the other piece of that is reflection. At the end of practice, are kids able to say, hey, these things went well tonight, these things I need to do a little bit of a better job at, and so on. So some reflection. You can build these things into your practice very early in the season, and they're great skills. The coach probably initiates more of that at the start of the year, and then as the season goes on, we'd like to see the athlete taking more and more control over those things. In the specific prep period where we're training under high intensity and there's going to be a lot of challenges in practice and tough drills, we want to make sure the athletes develop the skills of arousal control and mental toughness. They're not getting too high or too low depending on what's happening in the gym. They're not getting distracted by, the football team walking by or looking in the window. They're tough. They're able to complete challenging drills with challenging objectives and stay focused and determined throughout that. Those are things that you can build in the specific prep period. And then a great thing in the competition prep period is game planning. I don't know how much of that happens at the club level. I think it happens for some teams, but just sitting down with your team and figuring out how you are going to overcome certain aspects of an opponent. You can do it in your own gym. You can have two groups of 6 playing against each other, and you can have them plan how they're going to beat their opponent, and you can guide them through that. But doing that in your competition prep period and then using those skills in your major competition is going to be a real useful tool for you. And really, you could probably start that earlier in your season if you wanted, but this is just kind of a way to break it down. The last thing I want to say about this is general preparation drills or acquisition style drills can be used at any time in the season. And athletes enjoy these drills. If you get really competitive athletes that really care about their performance, they're going to want to go back to basics from time to time and just work on their passing angle or work on their attacking decision making. You can use those drills at any time, and the great thing about most acquisition drills is they can be made more challenging depending on the level of your athlete. So don't lock yourself in too much to a certain type of drill for a certain phase of the season, because general prep drills can be used anytime. And I think my colleague Chris Lawson is actually going to be talking about that in a future webinar, so that would be one to keep an eye on. We want to get back to the plan here, and we want to talk about something else that I feel is confusing at times for people when they're building a plan, and that is this whole conversation about macro cycles and mesocycles and microcycles. And I'm going to give you probably like the simplest non-scientific version of this as possible. But a mesocycle is basically just a period of training with one or two objectives in mind that you want to accomplish during that period. So in this plan, I've tried to break out mesocycles. One thing I'll add is they're always about 3 to 6 weeks in length. I've tried to break out mesocycles that divide our training into a focus of either more technical in nature, or more tactical in nature. Okay? I'm going to say that a slightly different way. Over the course of the year, we want our training to go from more technical at the start to more tactical or team-oriented at the end. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it. We want to develop our skills at the start, and then by the end, we should be playing together as a team and operating on, firing on all cylinders and working together to accomplish team objectives. But those team objectives always fail if there's weak links, and those weak links are usually tied to poor skill development. So we want to kind of phase our training so that we're building out our technical base with a little bit of tactics, individual tactics up front. And then we want to gradually go into more and more team play, team-oriented play. So when you look at this, keep that in mind when you look at these numbers here. Is I've divided the season, our mock season, into different mesocycles, all about 3 to 6 or 3 to 5 weeks in length. And we've given sort of a training focus to each of those mesocycles. Okay. You can see we're going to start with about 90% of our focus and practice during this period on technical, about 10% tactical. And towards the end, when we're getting ready for nationals, we shouldn't really be learning how to pass at that phase. So maybe we'll do a little bit of skill refinement at the start of practice, but we'll be doing a lot of gameplay style drills, a lot of tactics towards the end. So I think that's about the simplest I can make that. There's all kinds of research online. If you look out there, you will find it. But I need to move on. So one thing that you will all know, or should all know now, is what are your training hours? How much time do you have in the gym? What nights, what tournaments do you play in? And this is going to allow us to build out the next piece of our plan. So in this example, I'm saying this team trains Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday for 2 hours, and they're going to compete, I think, approximately 6 hours in each of the tournaments that we've decided to play in. The Ontario Championships and Nationals is a 3-day tournament, and so let's say 18 hours for those. And lo and behold, that actually works perfectly for my training to competition ratio that I am supposed to follow for the long-term athlete development model. So that works out well. So I can now look at my schedule and say, all right, I'm on track to the appropriate training ratios. Or if you had something different, then maybe you can find some creative ways to adjust your training to make that ratio work. So maybe you have too many tournaments, so your competition percentage is really high. Well, are there some of those tournaments that you could use maybe more with, maybe have more of a training focus at? That's something that you should be able to look at and problem solve. Maybe you have way too much training. Well, there's always tournaments out there. Perhaps you can find some additional tournaments for your team to play in and get the competition numbers a little higher. You can troubleshoot that on your own, but that's essentially for your plan. One of the easy parts here is just filling in the blanks. How many hours are you practicing on which day? We break it out nicely here. We'll say Monday, 2 hours, Wednesday, 2 hours on this week, Thursday, 2 hours, and some point of this week of September 29th, we played in an exhibition tournament and we played for 6 hours. Okay, so that's how that works. The next thing that we want to add is the physical preparation hours and the mental prep hours. So remember, we have to train the complete athlete. So we need to have some time for physical prep. We need to have some time for mental prep. How am I going to fit 3 hours of mental prep in when I only have 3 practices a week? Well, chances are you're not, okay? So maybe there's something that you can come up with where you do 20 minutes of physical preparation at the start or end of practice 3 times a week. That covers off 1 hour, and the kids have something they can do for a couple of hours away from the gym. A lot of kids these days have trainers. There's probably some creative solutions out there for you. Mental prep, again, we want to do this about an hour a week. Well, based on some of the things that we talked about, the kids can be doing some of this stuff before they get to the gym, before practice, and after when they get home. If it's visualization or goal setting, or if it's reflection, they can do that just on either end of practice time. It shouldn't have to take a lot of time out of your practice. All right. Here's where I'm going to break away from the model a little bit and talk to you about what I like to do. And that is to put my performance goals and my baseline information right into my plan. So I devote a section directly for my performance goals because I want to make sure that I look at those goals every time I look at my plan, which is at least once a week. So I want to make sure I'm always reminding myself of what I'm trying to train and why. Why do I want to work on something tonight? Well, that something is going to lead me towards my goals. So we've talked about collecting baseline data. Let's say, again, I used my tournament on the weekend to take some stats, and I've got some stats from my team. Not very good, but this is what they are. And I've done all my homework, and I know where my team needs to be by the end of the season to have a successful year performance-wise, or to put ourselves in the best position to succeed. And I'm going to put that data here at the end. Okay? And these are just some of the stats I like to use. You can certainly do your research and use any that make sense for your team. That's just some to help illustrate the point of what I want to do here in my plan. Okay, I will make this plan available. I'll talk to LP on how to do that, but if anyone wants to take this at the end of the session, that's no problem. All right, then I want to fill in my milestones or my performance milestones along the way. So I have, 6, 8, 10, whatever tournaments. I can be collecting data at each of those tournaments, and I can be taking stats at each of those tournaments. I can have the kids on the bench take stats. I can have an assistant coach take stats. I can record it and I can watch the video after and take the stats myself. It shouldn't be too hard to collect this information if you want it. And if you do want it and if you use it, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to figure out where you are as you work towards coming top 5 at provincials or whatever your outcome goals were. How are you tracking on your performance indicators? And that's why we're going to set some performance milestones along the way and then constantly make sure our training is allowing us to work towards those milestones. Okay? All right, so we've got our goals and we've got our milestones. Now I need to know, what do I train? Like, what do I have to train to achieve my goals? How much time do I have? What system of play is best suited to my athlete's strengths? Like, these are the kind of questions that you're going to have to think about and mull over and answer for yourself, because every team's different. What Waterloo does is going to be different than what you do. What MVC does is going to be different than what Halton does. It's not a club thing. It's probably a function of what athletes you have, what your club's plan is for you, if you have such a thing, through your technical director, what your athlete's development pathway is. All of these things are going to factor into what you actually train. And I can't tell you what those are, but I can help you categorize what some of the things that you might train or think about are. And so that's what I'm going to try to do here for you. And this is going to look maybe scary, maybe colorful, maybe you don't know what to think about this, but this is a way to look at the various aspects of the game. And that's going to be what you see here on the left-hand side. And then we're going to determine how long and in what way we're going to train these skills. Okay, so we've got some skills, some ball control type skills. We've got serving, various aspects of serving, aspects of attacking, aspects of offense, blocking, and defense. So I actually got this information from someone who I respect incredibly, an incredible amount, and that's Glenn Hogue, who is the just former head coach of our national team. So one of the things Glenn does in his plan is he divides the training tasks by the categories you see here, and then he'll determine, depending on his athletes or where his team is in their season, which of those skills he needs to train, and at what stage of development each of his team or his athletes are at with those skills or those training tasks. So let's use the first section here on titled skills to talk about what I've actually done here and what these colors mean and how I would build out a training plan in this manner. Okay, the first thing that we need to understand is just the phases of development. So when someone wants to learn how to perform a certain skill, we call that acquisition, or when someone's in an early development stage, we call that acquisition. But once someone has proficiency with that skill, and then they start to consolidate it within the context of the game and other skills, and then at some point it's kind of second nature and they just refine that skill through gameplay. Well, assuming that, again, that this is a team of 15-year-olds, we're going to look at a possible development plan for the various skills that you see here. So anything that you see in white is something that is not currently intended to be trained in the plan for that particular week. So sequences of skills or team reception, we're not going to train that in the first week. Okay, but we are going to train ball control, individual reception, individual setting, serving basics. We are going to train or try to acquire those skills. And everywhere that you see green is a week where our athletes will be in the acquisition stage of that particular skill. Hope that makes sense. Once we feel that they are or should be moving on from the acquisition phase, we are going to move into an early consolidation or a late consolidation phase. And the reason that we categorize the development that way is because the methods that we would use to train those skills change depending on where we are in the development of that particular skill. Okay, let me use ball control for an example. An acquisition drill that focuses on ball control is something that deals with the relationship of the athlete and the ball, or the athlete, the ball, and a target. So very simple drills. Okay. When we get into the early or late consolidation phases, we start to build on that, where the athletes are making decisions and using, I guess, their brain along with performing the skill. So they're reading aspects of the game, and they are making decisions. So reading a server or reading a blocker, for instance, reading the defense, or being a defender and reading the play in front of you, and then performing the skill or executing the skill correctly, is something that we would layer in once a basic foundation of the skill is acquired. In the late consolidation phase, we start to perform the skill at a higher level. We're making multiple decisions, but we make those decisions with a bit of an advantage given in our favor. So one example might be we need to learn to hit past a block. Well, we're going to move that block into a position early to give the hitter a little bit more time to read the play and work on reading and performing the skill together. When we get into the refinement stage, we're actually going to do the opposite. We're going to disadvantage the athlete, so they have to perform a skill with a time or a space pressure or additional pressure on them to perform the skill in game-like conditions. So I don't want to get too much into that. That's material that you'll find in your advanced development or performance coaching courses. But this plan and Glenn's categorization of training is sort of a logical way to think through how and when you would want to train the various skills that you need to accomplish with your athletes throughout the season. Okay, hope that is clear. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. And then I will also include in this presentation the training codes. And Glenn has really given a clear indication of what his objectives are for that particular training task. So you can, regardless of what level you coach at, you should be able to relate that objective back to something that your team needs to work on. So that's going to be in here in this presentation for you as well. The other considerations that we have to make when we're building out a plan, and we're getting close to the end here, but our physical and our mental development. So back to the LTAD, we have goals for our athletes in terms of what they should be working on physically and mentally at their development stage. Okay, so if we look at the goals in the train to train phase, we see that aerobic and strength are two of the main skills or athletic abilities that we can focus on and get great gains from in this development stage. We can also get a lot of mental gains, so mental, cognitive, emotional development of mental preparation. We've talked about some of those things, and that's good because we're going to factor those into our plan. Okay, this graph on the right, we won't spend too much time talking about, but basically this is an indicator of, depending on the development age, what athletic abilities or skills will get the most improvement in your athletes at that particular age, and that'll be reflected in the LTAD, as we mentioned. Okay, so I need to look at the mental skills, and very similar to what we did before, we're going to apply sort of that acquisition, consolidation, refinement type idea to when we want to build these skills out in our plan. We had talked about game planning. We talked about focus, mental toughness, arousal control, visualization, performance analysis, and performance reflection. So, we've already done our homework. We already know that we need to train these things. So let's put them into our plan. And the way that I've put them in here kind of flows logically with what we had talked about before in terms of what we want to develop in the general prep phase, what we want to develop in the specific preparation phase and what is going to go into or be developed further in the competition phase. So we can phase this mental training into our practices, as we mentioned, as our season goes on. The other thing we haven't mentioned yet, which is very important to educate your athletes on, is nutrition and hydration. Hydration is a major issue. I don't know if issue is the right word, but it's a concern because teenagers do not drink enough water, and that's basically the punchline. We need to be reminding our athletes to hydrate. They need to be drinking water before practice. They need to be drinking water during practice and after practice. Once they leave, obviously that's out of your control, but if we can educate them on the importance of that early on in the season, hopefully by the time we're getting into these important tournaments, they know how much water they should be drinking, and they own that skill of instructing themselves on how much to drink and when and why and all of those other great things. So again, we want to train, we want to be responsible for all the aspects of our athletes' development, and that's why we break it down to this, what some might say level of minutia, is we want to make sure they learn these things along the way. Okay, physical training. I'm going to build this one out in a slightly different way because we could get into a whole long conversation about physical training, and I don't want to do that, but I just want to highlight that strength was noted as one of the key aspects of development in the train to train age. Jerry, high school volleyball. So Jerry's question, if anyone's not following the chat box, is to include a section in the seasonal plan related to high school volleyball. I mean, I agree. For you to know the volume that those athletes are getting in the high school gym is a great thing to know. I haven't put it into this plan. I have a couple thoughts on the high school volleyball, and I don't want to get into the argument of whether they should or shouldn't play, but I've watched some of that volleyball, and it's not very intense, and it's not super competitive, and I don't think they practice or train in the way that you guys are probably thinking about how they should practice or train. I think it's a good exercise to just go and watch a game or two, see what it's like. The biggest concern I have about that is the athletes not taking care of their bodies. And that's why I think it ties back to our plan, is if we can teach our athletes good habits on hydration and stretching and how to actually take care of their bodies and prevent injury, then we should be okay dealing with the high school volleyball conflict. If we don't do that, or if they're lazy with those habits when they're at their high school gym, then the risk of injury goes up. So that's kind of what I think about that. There's also, someone asked a question about, do I have a recommended software? I just use Excel. I'm kind of an Excel nerd, but this stuff that I'm showing you here is really not hard to do. It's pretty much just highlighting boxes and, putting in borders. So I think anyone should be able to figure this out. I don't know of a specific volleyball software for building spreadsheets or plans, but Excel, or I think there's something for Apple users, I think there's something equivalent. But back to the strength planning. So we know that our athletes can develop some strength gains in this phase of their development. So how do we plan that out? Well, just here's some simple concepts to consider that we talked about before. We want to establish some core strength, some functional movement, some mobility and stability in our bodies before we try to add a load or bear a load, like putting weights on a bar, or before we try to develop increases in power. Power always comes after we've developed strength and efficiency in our body. So I've tried to structure a plan here where we have about 10 weeks or so, or 2 5-week periods of training for strength, where we focus on our core strength and our body weight as the main load that we're trying to manipulate. And then we get into maximum strength and then power on top of that. So that's kind of a logical sequence of how you would train those things. I always suggest talking to an S&C strength and conditioning professional about these things, because every circumstance, every athlete is a little different, especially if you have athletes with previous injuries. You're going to want to have a specific plan for each of them. One thing that we can develop at every age is our suppleness or flexibility. We definitely want to be incorporating dynamic movements at the start of practice, and static movements can be used at the end of practice. Okay. The last thing that comes up when we talk about planning and this, again, I think could be a whole topic on its own. I heard Carrie talk about this a little bit on a previous webinar, and that is the training load and rest and recovery and how these things work together. So there's sort of a triangle. The easiest way to think of it, there's a triangle where of the 3 factors of frequency, volume, and intensity, you can really only have 2 in play at a time. So what I mean by that is if you're going to train at a very high volume and a high intensity, then you're going to want to do that less frequently. If you're going to train at a high volume and high frequency, you want those workouts to be a little less intense. If you're going to train at high intensity and high frequency, then your volume should be lower. So that's kind of how those factors work together. And I would recommend in your season that you manipulate these variables and you have different weeks or periods in your training plan and your periodization plan where you're using these factors differently. So as we'll see in a moment, we're going to have some high volume, high intensity weeks. We'll have some low volume weeks. There's nothing better than experience to help you determine what works for your team. And as your coaching career goes on, I encourage you to experiment with different combinations to find what is going to lead to the peak performance of the kids that you work with. One thing I will say, though, is a great way to track intensity is through counting jumps. And I think Kerry mentioned this in his webinar as well. But jumping is a relative measure of intensity. And there are devices out there now, like the VERT device, which most of you have probably heard about, which can actually count how many times you jump in a practice and how high each of the jumps was and so on. So if we want to manipulate the intensity of our practices, one of the ways we can kind of keep track of how that of how intense a practice is by counting the jumps on our athletes. And there's 2 ways to do it. There's the intensity of a jump, which could be considered like how high is a jump, and then there's like how many times do you jump. Setters will jump a lot more than left sides, but setters, especially jump setters, will be jumping a lot lower. So they might be jumping 6 inches, 7 inches at a time, whereas your big, powerful left side attacker might be jumping 30 inches or more. So the jumps are going to be a lot more intense from certain players. And what I've done for you here is provided you a bit of a breakdown of what a low intensity practice, a medium intensity practice, and a high intensity practice would be based on the jump counts for different positions. So this is information that we've collected and tested here at Waterloo. We know, for instance, in a match, our middle blockers will jump about 150 times, give or take. Well, do we want to train for them to be jumping more than that? Do they need to be jumping 200 times a practice? I don't know. Probably not. So our high a high jump count practice, we want to be around 140 jumps for them. Setters, I've seen jump as many as 220 times in practice, but as we said before, they're not jumping as high as some of the other positions. There is a lot to consider when you're building out or factoring in the training load on your athletes. And I just talked about what my biggest concern about the high school season was, is like how many more jumps those athletes are having in the course of a day or a week. So that is something to be aware of for sure. And getting a sense for what they do in practice and what they do in a game would be a good exercise for you just in your initial information gathering phase. So how do we go back to our plan now and factor in a training load, and what does that look like? So the training load, which I've added in here, is I can describe it like this. The color is indicative of the intensity that we would train in that week, and the number of squares in the case of the week of September 8th, 5, the number of squares is indicative of the volume of training. Okay, and again, I encourage you to try to come up with your own version of this, but I can give you some guidelines of what I think is important when it comes to training load and volume. And that is, first, you want to make sure that over a period of about 4 weeks, you average out to something around a medium volume and intensity. The other thing is you want to make sure that after a very high volume or a very intense week that you pull back on one of those factors. So if you have a really high volume, high intensity training week, you want to make sure the next week allows for a little bit more rest and recovery. So maybe you still have a high volume, but you do far less intense drills, or you have some practices where there's no jumping. These are things that you are going to want to factor into your plan overall. And that leads to kind of the last piece is, when do you want to taper, or in other words, when do you want to peak for competition? Well, we already know, I've talked about the provincials being where I want to peak for competition in this example. So I want to design a taper or a reduction in my training that is going to allow me to achieve my peak performance at that competition. And the simplest way to think about a taper is it's going to be a period of time before your competition, about 1 to 2 weeks or 8 to 14 days, where your training load or your training volume reduces by about 50%, but you still maintain a high level of intensity. So let's say you're 10 days away from provincials and you've been training like a high 80% volume practice and high intensity. Well, you're going to want to pull back on the volume. Maybe you practice only for an hour and a half that night or an hour, but you still achieve your body's peak level of intensity. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about tapering in order to peak for competition. We want the body to be rid of its fatigue that's associated with training, but we want to be able to achieve our maximum competition presence, I guess would be the best word. We want to be in our peak physical and mental condition for the competition. So that is a bit of a discussion on training load. And again, you could find books and books and books on this topic. I'm giving you the simplified volleyball coach version, but those are some thoughts that I have on that. And that takes me to the end here. So we have talked about kind of establishing our current state, talked about defining our end state. We've worked a little bit together on building out a plan that would work to accomplish those objectives. It's a lot of information in a short period of time, but I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you guys might have. So you can fire them into the chat bar, and I will do my best. Okay, there's a question that came in. Is there an app that I use to gather statistical data for my team performance? I personally do not use an app per se. I actually enjoy just using a pen and paper. I will sit down, I record all of our matches, I record our practices, and I like to just actually go back and watch all of it on double speed, and I take the stats by hand. Another thing that we do use, I guess it's kind of an app, is we use a video analysis tool called VidSwap. And what that does for every team in our league actually is it takes our game video once our game is complete, and it breaks it down into basically a statistical or a tagged version of our match. So I do get some statistics that way, but for me, I like to see firsthand what my team is doing. And for me, it's not always just the stats that I care about, but I like to see what was the root cause of why a stat was the way it was. So if Sally had 5 errors, that's not as important to me as if me seeing why Sally had 5 errors, because then I can relate that back to something I'm doing in training. So the next question is from Jerry. How willing am I to stray from my seasonal plan based on performance in matches and competitions? I think being flexible is a very important quality. A plan is a plan, but plans change. It doesn't hurt to take a look at your plan often and say, hey, like, am I on track here? Or maybe I intended to be at a certain performance level and I just really missed the mark. Like, I want to look back at those practices and figure out what happened, what went wrong. And one thing I've started to do this year actually is keep a calendar of the full year where I write down on my calendar what we trained, what went well, what didn't, and I'm actually going to use this calendar to build out my plan for future years. So that whole exercise that we just went through, I want that to get better and more refined every year that I do it. And I'm still relatively young in the sport, so hopefully I have another 15, 20 years that I can be making that plan a little bit better each and every year. But yeah, I definitely like to look back and make adjustments where necessary. Now, I will say this, if I can go back here. One of the great things about designing your plan with sort of a general statement on, or a general indication of what skills you want to acquire and where, is you can get to the very specific level when you get to the practice. So let's say, let's use the first week of training here, for instance. Like, let's say I spent the first 4 weeks developing some aspect of ball control, but in my tournament, it revealed that I had really missed or got wrong another aspect of ball control. Well, I've still planned an acquisition period for that skill. I can now go into practice and define what I need to train on that night. So it gives you like some specificity in terms of how you're going to train the skills and when, but not exactly what you're going to do in every practice. Hope that makes sense. Does anyone else have any other questions? So there's a couple questions that just popped up. So from Jenny, do I ever take video of my practices? Actually, yeah, all the time. Any time that we are, no, really, I guess it's safe to say almost every night. I can't say I watch it every night, but Anytime that there is something that we are learning or I'm trying to implement, or even if there was something that went wrong in practice, I like to go back and watch it and figure out if there was a way I could have taught it better, or if there was a misunderstanding on what an athlete was supposed to do. And really, like, everything that you see with your own eyes during practice looks a little bit different when you watch it back on video. Things you thought went really well don't always look great when you separate the emotion and you go home and you just watch it, sitting on the couch. So I think it's a good practice. I think it's good to watch yourself on video too as a coach, and think about how you sound or how you come across to the athletes, because what you see on video doesn't always match what you feel in the gym. So I think it's a good, just like we want the athletes to reflect, we want to reflect as well at the end of the night. Will I be sharing this deck? Yes. And LP already answered that one. Any other thoughts or questions? Is there anything that anyone does on the webinar that might be interesting to share? It's maybe something I missed, or something you do in your own experience. Do I have athletes journal my practice? Just while you're thinking about that, there's another question. Yeah, we do, actually. We keep it really simple, though. What I ask my athletes to do, and I actually just stole this from all the NCCP courses that we do, is just write down something that they would start based on the practice, something they would stop, and something they would continue. It's just the practice, or just the process, actually, of sitting down, thinking about the practice, thinking about maybe something you learned, something that you want to change, and something that you want to keep doing. And I took that right out of the NCCP courses that we all have to take. The question from Larissa. Hey, Larissa. How often are you having individual meetings with your girls throughout the season? I have specific meetings with the girls. So I like to meet with everyone at the start of the year in sort of a formal setting. And that's where I talk to the athletes about what their role is going to be on the team, and we lay out their performance objectives. And then beyond that, I like to just get what I would call just touches. So I try to find a way to interact or engage with individuals as often as I can, whether it's before practice or after practice. I would say in terms of official meetings, probably 3 or 4 times a year. But anytime I have to bring them into my office is usually kind of a formal setting. So I prefer to just talk to athletes like a real human when I can outside of the office. What do you suggest to tell parents who argue you should be playing in more competitions when that messes up your LTAD ratios? Oh, man. Well, I am not an arbitrator between coaches and parents. I would say, when you know what your why is and you have a good, clear plan, and you can articulate that to parents as something that will help the athletes improve and meet all their goals that you guys have mutually decided on, I would like to think that would be enough. I mean, Jerry, you probably have more experience in that world than me. What do you do? I'm sure other people are wondering about that as well. It's hard to get parents to it's hard to get parents to understand the LTAD, and everyone thinks competition, more, play more, go down to the US more, this and that. They don't always consider what's best is beyond what knowledge they may have. So there's probably some ways to educate that don't come across as condescending. Jerry, tell them that concert pianists don't schedule more concerts to get better. Yeah, I mean, there you go. Haven't used that one yet. A question from Amy. Do I ever go over my athletes' start, stop, and continue in their journaling with them? No. Anything that my athletes write in their journal is for them. But if they want to talk to me about the things that they're thinking about, or if they want some help with it, I'm happy to help, but I never read, share, or go into their journal, because when they're good at that, they usually start to be pretty honest in it, and you know, I only get involved if they want me to be. Jenny, at the club level, what age do you think is a good age to introduce them to practice or game film? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think start even simpler than that. I think just kids need to learn how to see themselves on video, and it's probably easiest when it's just them on the screen performing a particular skill. If you throw them right into watching like a 6-on-6 match and getting them to try to focus on something other than, you know, what someone looks like or their hair or where the ball's going, that becomes like a big thing to chew. So we want to acquire that ability just like our other abilities. We want to start simple, something, a relationship between them and the viewing device, and you guiding them through what to look at. And then we can have them watch themselves in a, let's say, a specific prep drill or a consolidation drill where there's some moving pieces. And then they can start to watch themselves on video with an understanding of your team's tactics, and making it slow and explaining what's happening, and then getting them ultimately to explain to you what's happening. So I think I would make sure it's a casual introduction, but I think that can start early. Like I don't see any reason why a kid can't watch themselves on film from a young age, say 12 or 13, and if they have a clear image from you what that skill should look like, then maybe they can start to make the comparison themselves, and that's going to be far more valuable for them than trying to do the skill the way you told them to do it, versus them seeing the skill perform correctly and them seeing themselves perform the skill, figuring out the difference between the two, and then working to make the two match. I think that is a really valuable thing for the kids to do at a young age. And tell them to tell their parents that concert pianists don't get better with more concerts. Is there any other questions? Really appreciate you guys taking your time to sit in on this. I hope it was informative. I know it was a lot of info, and I hope you have a great night. LP, unless you have anything, it sounds like we're all good. Thank you all. You're welcome.